Sometimes the hardest battles we face aren't against nature, but against the silence between people we love. For 68-year-old Jack Merrow, that silence had lasted 10 years. He lived alone in his Alaska cabin, estranged from his children after a falling out that broke his family apart. Then, one October night, his daughter Eleanor showed up with 2 teenage grandsons he barely knew. She was running from a broken marriage and had nowhere else to go. Days later, during a blizzard, a pack of white wolves surrounded their cabin. Jack did something that seemed like madness. He walked outside alone with nothing but a torch to face them. But why would an aging man risk everything for a family that had abandoned him? Before we continue, tell us where you're watching from, and if this story moves you, subscribe, because tomorrow's story is something truly special. October in Alaska's interior arrives with a particular kind of silence, the kind that settles into your bones and makes you forget what other voices sound like. Jack Merrow had grown accustomed to that silence over the past decade, the way a man grows accustomed to an old injury that never quite heals, but becomes part of who he is. The cabin sat in a clearing surrounded by black spruce and paper birch, 30 miles from the nearest town, if you could call a cluster of 12 buildings a town. Jack had built most of it himself 40 years ago, back when Margaret was alive and their children were young. Back when laughter echoed off these log walls and the smell of her cooking filled every corner. Now, the photographs sat face down on the mantel. He'd turned them over the year after she died, unable to bear seeing what he'd lost. Some men talked to photographs of the departed. Jack had chosen silence instead. He woke before dawn, as he had every morning for longer than he could remember. The routine was sacred, each action performed with the precision of ritual. Check the wood stove, bank the coals, add 3 logs, never 2, never 4. Fill the kettle from the hand pump at the kitchen sink. Measure coffee grounds into the percolator, the same chipped enamel pot Margaret had used. While the coffee brewed, he stepped onto the porch in his long underwear and boots, steam rising from his breath into the pre-dawn darkness. The thermometer read 28 degrees, mild for late October, but the hard cold was coming. He could feel it in his joints, in the way the wind carried itself through the trees. The clearing spread before him like a cathedral, tall spruce forming pillars that reached toward a sky just beginning to lighten at the edges. Somewhere in the distance, a great horned owl called its territory. Closer, the creek murmured over stones, not yet frozen but thinking about it. Jack had learned to read this land the way other men read newspapers. Every sound meant something. Every shift in the wind carried information. The wilderness didn't lie or pretend. It simply was, indifferent to human need, but fair in its indifference. After coffee, he dressed in layers, thermal underwear, wool pants, flannel shirt, down vest. His boots were 30 years old, resoled 4 times, broken in so completely they felt like extensions of his feet. He took his walking stick from beside the door, hand-carved from Sitka spruce, notched with small marks that only he understood. Each notch represented something: Margaret's death, Eleanor's wedding, the last time Philip visited, the day he'd stopped expecting them to call. 37 marks in all, a calendar of losses measured in wood. The trapline ran a circuit of 5 miles through his territory. He didn't trap much anymore, just enough to keep the skills sharp and justify the license. Mostly he walked to maintain his presence in the land's awareness. Animals noticed absence. They knew when a territory went unpatrolled. The first trap held nothing. The second had been sprung by a squirrel too small to trigger properly, the bait stolen. At the third, he found a marten, sleek and dark, long dead in the cold night. He reset the trap with practiced efficiency, tucked the marten into his pack. As he walked, his mind settled into the rhythm of movement. This was when thoughts came unbidden, memories he'd successfully avoided during busier moments. Margaret's voice saying his name, Eleanor as a little girl, bringing him wildflowers. Philip teaching him to skip stones at the creek, so serious about getting the technique right. The fallout had happened 7 years ago at Eleanor's wedding. Jack had never liked Graham. From the first meeting, something in the man's eyes, the way he smiled without warmth, reaching past his teeth. At the reception, after too much whiskey and not enough sense, Jack had pulled Eleanor aside. "You sure about this?" he'd asked. Not too late to reconsider. Her face had transformed, joy replaced by fury. "You can't just be happy for me, not even on my wedding day? I'm trying to protect you." From what? From being happy? From having a life that isn't buried in the woods like yours? The words that followed had been sharp enough to draw blood. Things about Margaret's death, about Jack's withdrawal, about his failure as a father. He'd responded in kind, pride and pain making him cruel. Philip had taken Eleanor's side, and Jack had left the reception early, driving through the night back to Alaska. Neither child had called since. He'd told himself it was for the best, that they were better off without his darkness infecting their lives. But late at night, when the cabin was too quiet and the walls pressed in, he knew he'd made a mistake. Pride had kept him from apologizing. Pride and the certainty that some words, once spoken, couldn't be taken back. He'd written letters to Philip over the years, dozens of them, updating his son on the seasons, the animals, the small details of survival. He'd never sent a single one. They sat in a drawer in his bedroom, bundled with twine, evidence of all the conversations he'd chosen not to have. By noon, he'd completed the trapline and returned to the cabin. The marten pelt would need processing, scraping, stretching, drying, work that kept his hands busy and his mind occupied. He set up his workbench on the porch, the afternoon sun providing enough warmth to make the task bearable. His hands moved with the confidence of decades of practice. The knife blade caught light as it separated membrane from hide, the motion hypnotic and precise. This was honest work, taking what the land provided and wasting nothing. Margaret had taught him that. She'd grown up on a farm in Montana, knew about respecting what you killed. She'd been a teacher before moving to Alaska, drawn by adventure and the promise of something different from the expected life. They'd met at a community meeting about building a new school. She'd argued passionately for a library. He'd sat in back, saying nothing, struck dumb by her certainty and fire. It took him 3 months to work up courage to speak to her, another 2 before he managed to ask her to dinner. She'd laughed not unkindly and said yes, before he'd finished stumbling through the invitation. "You're not much of a talker, are you?" She'd observed on their first date. "No, ma'am. That's all right. I talk enough for both of us." She had too. Margaret could fill a silence with warmth and words, creating bridges where Jack built walls. She'd been the one who maintained relationships, who remembered birthdays and made phone calls and invited people over. Without her, Jack's social connections had withered like plants denied water. The afternoon stretched long and golden, the sun angling through the spruce in ways that only happened in October. Jack finished with the marten pelt and moved on to splitting wood, another task that required more muscle memory than thought. The maul rose and fell in steady rhythm, each impact sending split halves tumbling to either side of the chopping block. He'd cut enough wood to last 3 winters, but still he cut more. The work kept him strong, kept his shoulders loose and his hands capable. At 68, he couldn't afford to go soft. The wilderness demanded strength, and weakness out here could kill you as surely as a bullet. His body bore the evidence of decades in this place. Scars on his hands from knives and axes and barbed wire. A crooked finger that had been broken and set poorly 20 years back. Knees that ached in cold weather, a shoulder that reminded him of its existence every morning. But he was still capable, still strong enough to do what needed doing. The radio check-in came at 4 o'clock, as it did every day. He went inside, brushed wood chips from his vest, and keyed the microphone on his CB radio. "Base, this is Merrow. Daily check-in." Static, then Hank's voice crackling through. "Roger that, Jack. Everything good out there?" "Same as yesterday. Same as tomorrow. Storm system moving in next week. Could be a big one." I'll be ready. You always are. Anything you need on the next supply run. Jack considered. He had enough of everything. Food, fuel, ammunition. Enough to last until spring if he had to. I'm good, Hank. Thanks for asking. All right then, stay safe out there. You too. The radio fell silent. Jack sat for a moment, looking at the device. 3 minutes of human contact. The most he'd have all week. There'd been a time when Hank tried to draw him into longer conversations, asked personal questions, pushed past Jack's walls. He'd given up years ago, accepted that Jack preferred his solitude. Evenings settled in with the particular hush that comes before the season's first serious snow. Jack prepared his dinner venison stew from the freezer, bread he'd baked 3 days prior, coffee strong enough to strip paint. He ate at the table, alone, the only sound the scrape of spoon against bowl. After washing up, he settled into his chair by the wood stove with a piece of basswood and his carving knife. His hands knew what to do without consulting, his brain smooth the rough edges, find the shape hidden in the wood, release it with patient cuts. Tonight it was a wolf. He carved them often, drawn to their self-sufficiency and their loyalty to pack. Wolves mated for life, defended their own with ferocity, and asked nothing from the world except what they could take themselves. Jack understood wolves better than he understood people. He'd coexisted with the same pack for nearly a decade, 5 or 6 grey timber wolves that denned somewhere north of his property and hunted a circuit that overlapped with his territory. He called them the Greys, though he'd never named them individually. That felt too much like claiming ownership over something wild. They had an understanding, he and the Greys. They didn't bother his cabin or his cache, and he didn't interfere with their hunts. Sometimes he'd see them at distance, grey shapes moving through the trees like smoke. Once, the alpha had stood at the edge of his clearing at dawn, just watching. Jack had watched back, each measuring the other. After several minutes, the wolf had turned and disappeared into the forest. That was 3 years ago, and Jack still remembered the encounter with clarity. The wolf's eyes had been gold and ancient, carrying the weight of instinct refined over millennia. In those eyes, Jack had seen something he recognized, a fellow survivor who'd learned that trust was dangerous and solitude was safe. The carving took shape under his knife haunches, tail, pricked ears. He worked until his eyes grew heavy and the fire in the stove burned low. Then he banked the coals, checked the doors, and climbed the ladder to his sleeping loft. The bed was too big for one person, a fact that had bothered him for the first few years after Margaret's death. Now he barely noticed, sleeping on his side of the mattress out of habit, leaving her side empty and undisturbed. He lay in darkness, listening to the cabin settle around him. The logs contracted in the cold, making small popping sounds. The wind had picked up, testing the corners, looking for gaps. Somewhere distant, the Greys were howling their usual evening chorus, marking territory and maintaining contact with dispersed pack members. Jack listened to their song, understanding its patterns. 3 distinct voices tonight, which meant the others were elsewhere or staying quiet. The alpha's howl was deepest, most resonant. The beta female's was higher, more urgent. The third voice belonged to one of the younger wolves, still learning the proper cadence and tone. They'd sing for a few minutes, then fall silent, then sing again. Communication that carried for miles through the cold air, telling other wolves that this territory was claimed, this pack was strong, stay away or face consequences. It occurred to Jack that he'd lived the same way, marking his territory, warning others off, maintaining solitude through displays of capability and self-sufficiency. The difference was that wolves did it out of instinct, survival behavior programmed into their bones. Jack had chosen it, made a conscious decision to push away the people who'd tried to stay close. Eleanor had tried. After the wedding, she'd called twice. Both times, Jack had let it go to voicemail. She'd left messages hurt, angry, asking why he couldn't just apologize. He'd deleted them without responding. The third time, she hadn't called at all. Philip had lasted longer, being the peacemaker by nature. He'd visited once, 6 months after the wedding, trying to bridge the gap. But Jack had been cold, distant, protecting himself with walls of silence. Philip had left after 2 days, frustration evident in every line of his body. "I can't force you to want us in your life," he'd said before leaving, "but don't pretend this is our choice. This is you, Dad. This has always been you." He'd been right, of course. Jack had spent his whole life building walls, letting Margaret be the bridge to the world. Without her, the walls had grown higher, the isolation more complete. It was easier this way. Loneliness was predictable. People weren't. Outside, the Greys concluded their evening song. Silence returned, broken only by wind and the settling of logs. Jack closed his eyes, willing sleep to come, knowing it would be hours before it did. This was his life now. This was what he'd chosen. And if sometimes, in the deep hours before dawn, he regretted that choice, well, regret was just another thing to live with, another scar that didn't show. The sound came just after dark on a Tuesday in late October, the unmistakable growl of an engine labouring up the rough track that served as Jack's driveway. He was at the stove, preparing tea, and the noise froze him mid-motion. Nobody came out here unannounced. The few people who knew where he lived understood the protocol. Radio ahead, confirm the visit, give him time to prepare or decline. An unexpected vehicle meant emergency or trouble, and Jack's hand moved instinctively toward the rifle mounted above the door. He set down the kettle and moved to the window, pulling aside the curtain just enough to see. Headlights bounced through the darkness, illuminating trees and underbrush as an old Jeep Cherokee navigated the final 100 yards. Not a vehicle he recognized, which deepened his concern. The Jeep pulled into the clearing and stopped, engine ticking in the sudden silence. The driver's door opened, and a woman stepped out, tall, thin, moving with exhaustion evident even at a distance. Behind her, 2 shapes emerged from the back seat, smaller, hesitant. Jack's breath caught in his chest. Even after 7 years, even in darkness, he knew his daughter's silhouette. Eleanor stood beside the Jeep, looking at the cabin like a soldier surveying a battlefield. The 2 shapes resolved into teenage boys, one tall and gangly, the other shorter and stockier, his grandsons, Caleb and Owen. He'd seen them last when they were small children, before the wedding, before everything fractured. For a long moment, nobody moved. Jack stood at the window, his hand still raised toward the rifle, his mind trying to process what he was seeing. Eleanor stood beside the vehicle, her shoulders squared, but her posture defeated in ways that had nothing to do with physical strength. Finally, she started toward the cabin. The boys followed, clearly reluctant, exchanging glances that Jack could read even through the darkness, confusion, resentment, fear. Jack moved to the door, opened it before Eleanor could knock. They faced each other across the threshold, 7 years of silence compressed into the space between them. She looked older. Lines around her eyes that hadn't been there before, grey threading through her dark hair. She'd lost weight, her face gaunt in a way that spoke of stress rather than intention. Her eyes were red-rimmed, exhausted. "Dad," she said, and her voice cracked on the single syllable. "Eleanor." His own voice sounded rusty, uncertain. "What are you doing here?" She stopped, gathered herself. "Can we come in?" "Please." He stepped aside, habits of hospitality older than their estrangement. The boys filed in past him, not meeting his eyes. Caleb, the older one, moved with barely contained hostility. Owen, younger, looked around the cabin with something closer to curiosity. Eleanor was the last to enter. She stopped in the doorway facing him. "I didn't know where else to go." Jack closed the door against the cold. The 4 of them stood in the main room, the space suddenly feeling too small despite being the same size it had always been. The wood stove ticked. The kettle on top began to whistle. a sound that seemed absurdly normal given the situation. "I'll make tea," Jack said, because he didn't know what else to say. Eleanor nodded, then seemed to realize the boys were still standing uncertainly near the door. "Sit down," she told them, gesturing to the table. They obeyed, moving like strangers in a foreign land. Jack busied himself with tea preparation, his hands performing familiar tasks while his mind raced. He found cups, 4 of them, dusty from disuse. He had to wash them at the sink, running water over chipped ceramic that Margaret had chosen decades ago. Behind him, Eleanor spoke quietly to the boys. "This is your grandfather's cabin. He built most of it himself. Your grandmother loved it here." "Why are we here?" Caleb asked, not bothering to lower his voice. "Why couldn't we stay with Uncle Philip? Philip has his own family to worry about." "We needed," Eleanor's voice caught. "We needed space, distance, somewhere to figure things out." Jack brought the tea to the table, setting cups in front of each person. Steam rose in the cool air of the cabin. He took the 4th chair, completing the circle, and looked at his daughter properly for the first time in 7 years. "What happened?" he asked. Eleanor wrapped her hands around her cup, not drinking, just absorbing the warmth. "Graham left. 3 weeks ago. There was someone else. Someone younger." She said it flatly, without emotion, as if describing weather. "The divorce is being finalized. He wanted the house. I couldn't." She stopped, breathed. "I couldn't stay there. Couldn't keep pretending everything was normal for the boys' sake." Caleb made a disgusted sound. Owen stared at his tea, saying nothing. Jack felt anger rise in his chest, hot, immediate, protective. The same anger he'd felt 7 years ago when he'd tried to warn Eleanor about Graham and she'd refused to listen. But voicing that now would help nothing, so he swallowed it down. "How long are you planning to stay?" he asked instead. "I don't know." Eleanor finally met his eyes. "Is that okay? I know we're not. I know I haven't." She stopped again, this time because tears were threatening. She pressed her palms against her eyes, fighting for control. Owen spoke for the first time, his voice quiet. "Mom said we could stay through winter, if that's all right with you." Jack looked at his younger grandson, 14, maybe 15 now. The boy had Margaret's eyes, he realized, green with gold flecks, the kind that seemed to see more than they should. "You can stay as long as you need," Jack said. "I'll take the couch. You 3 can have the bedroom." "We can't take your room," Eleanor protested. "I don't sleep much anyway." It was true. "The couch is fine." Silence settled over them again, but this time it felt slightly less hostile. Caleb continued to radiate resentment, his arms crossed, his jaw tight. But Owen seemed to relax incrementally, some of the tension leaving his shoulders. Eleanor drank her tea in small sips, her hands still trembling slightly. "I'm sorry," she said finally. "I'm sorry to just show up like this. I should have called, should have asked first, but "You're here now," Jack interrupted. "That's what matters." More silence. Then Caleb stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "I'm tired. Where are we sleeping?" Jack gestured toward the ladder. "Loft bedroom. There's a double bed and a cot. You boys can figure out who sleeps where." Caleb climbed the ladder without another word. Owen followed, pausing at the bottom to look back at Jack. "Thank you," he said quietly, then disappeared up into the loft. The storm arrived with the ferocity that only Alaska can deliver, turning the world beyond the cabin windows into a wall of white. For 3 days they were sealed in together, the universe compressed to log walls and the constant howl of wind testing every corner and gap. Caleb's resentment, which had been simmering since arrival, boiled over on the 2nd day. He paced the cabin like a caged animal, checking his phone repeatedly despite knowing there was no signal, sighing dramatically whenever silence stretched too long. "This is ridiculous," he announced to the room at large. "No internet, no cell service, nothing to do. We might as well be in prison." Eleanor looked up from the sock she was darning, her jaw tight. "Caleb, please." "Please what? Please pretend this isn't completely insane. You dragged us to the middle of nowhere because you couldn't deal with your own problems." "That's enough." Eleanor's voice carried warning, but Caleb ignored it. "Dad didn't want us anyway. He made that clear. But at least there I had friends, had a life. Here there's nothing. Just," he gestured around the cabin with contempt, "just this." Jack, who'd been working on the carved wolf by the stove, set down his knife carefully. He didn't look at Caleb, didn't acknowledge the outburst. Some battles weren't his to fight. Eleanor was still their mother, still responsible for discipline and boundaries. He wouldn't undermine that, no matter how much the boy's words stung. Eleanor stood, her own frustration finally breaking through. "You think this is easy for me? You think I wanted to come here to ask my father for help after 7 years of not speaking? I did this for you and Owen, to give you stability while everything else is falling apart." "Stability?" Caleb's laugh was bitter. "We're trapped in a cabin with a stranger who doesn't even want us here." "I never said that." Jack spoke quietly, still not looking up from his carving. "You didn't have to. It's written all over your face. We're an inconvenience, something you have to tolerate." Owen, who'd been sitting at the table working on sketches, closed his notebook carefully. "Caleb, stop." "Why? Because we're supposed to pretend everything's fine? That we're one big happy family now?" Eleanor moved toward her older son, her voice dropping to something dangerous and controlled. "Go upstairs. Cool off. We'll talk when you're capable of being civil." For a moment it looked like Caleb would argue further. Then he turned and climbed the ladder with deliberate, angry movements, each step a statement of protest. The loft fell silent above them. Eleanor sank back into her chair, her hands shaking. "I'm sorry. He's been like this since Graham left, angry at everything and everyone." "He's hurting," Jack said. "Anger's easier than hurt. That doesn't excuse the disrespect." "No, but it explains it." Jack finally looked up, met his daughter's eyes. "He'll come around, or he won't. Either way, he's welcome here as long as you need." Owen spoke up, his voice thoughtful. "Grandpa's right. Caleb's just mad Dad left. He thinks if he's angry enough at everything, it won't hurt as much." Eleanor reached across the table, squeezed Owen's hand. "When did you get so wise? Someone has to be the smart one." Owen offered a small smile, then looked at Jack. "Can I help you with the carving? I'd like to learn." Jack hesitated. Teaching meant connection, meant opening a door he'd kept closed for years. But the boy's eyes were hopeful, genuine. "Get yourself a piece of wood from the box by the door, something small to start." Owen practically leaped up, his earlier tension dissolving into enthusiasm. He rummaged through the kindling box, selecting pieces and rejecting them until he found one that satisfied some internal criteria. He brought it back to Jack, who examined it with the seriousness of a jeweler evaluating diamonds. "Basswood," Jack said. "Good choice. Soft enough to learn on, hard enough to hold detail." He handed Owen a spare knife from his collection, a small folding blade with a worn wooden handle. "Always cut away from yourself. Always keep your other hand behind the blade. Sharper is safer, dull knives slip." Owen nodded, absorbing the instructions with the intensity of a student before a master. Jack showed him how to hold the wood, how to angle the blade, how to let the knife do the work rather than forcing it. They worked in companionable silence, the only sounds the scrape of blades on wood and the storm raging outside. Eleanor watched them, her expression unreadable, then returned to her darning with something like relief in the set of her shoulders. Hours passed in this way, time marked by the accumulation of wood shavings on the floor and the gradual emergence of shapes from formless blocks. Jack found himself talking more than he had in years, explaining techniques Margaret had taught him, sharing stories about different types of wood and what they were good for. "Your grandmother was the real artist," he said at one point. "I just learned from watching her. She could carve birds so real you'd swear they'd fly away. Do you still have any of her carvings? Owen asked. Jack's hands stilled. A few. Packed away. He didn't mention where, didn't offer to show them. Some doors remained closed even as others cracked open. Eleanor stood and stretched, wincing at the stiffness in her back. I'm going to make dinner, or try to anyway. She moved to the kitchen area, opening cabinets, familiarizing herself with Jack's sparse but functional supplies. In one cabinet, behind cans of beans and bags of rice, she found a weathered tin box decorated with faded flowers. She pulled it out, recognizing it immediately even after all these years. "Dad," she said quietly. "Is this—" Jack looked over, saw what she held, and felt something tighten in his chest. "Your mother's recipe box. I forgot that was still there." Eleanor opened it with trembling hands. Inside were dozens of index cards covered in Margaret's careful handwriting recipes for bread, stew, cookies, pie. Notes in the margins about adjustments and preferences. "Extra vanilla," one note read. "Jack likes it sweeter." She pulled out a card at random. Margaret's beef stew, the same one Jack had been eating from the freezer for months. Her mother's voice seemed to echo from the paper, warm and certain, instructing and guiding. "I remember this," Eleanor whispered. "She made this every Sunday in winter." "Every Sunday for 30 years, Jack confirmed. Said it was her mother's recipe passed down. Eleanor sat heavily in a chair, the recipe box clutched to her chest. Tears streamed down her face unchecked, not dramatic sobbing, just a quiet release of grief too long held back. "I miss her so much. Every single day." Jack set down his carving, moved to his daughter's side. He stood awkwardly, unsure of how to offer comfort after so many years of distance. Finally, he rested a hand on her shoulder, a gesture small but genuine. "Me too," he said. "Every day." Owen watched them quietly, understanding that something significant was happening, some barrier dissolving. Above them in the loft, even Caleb had gone silent, perhaps listening, perhaps simply exhausted by his own anger. Eleanor wiped her eyes, managed a shaky smile. "I'll make the stew. Mom's way, I think. I think that would be good." She moved to the kitchen with new purpose, and Jack returned to his chair by the stove. The cabin felt different now, less like a fortress and more like what it had once been, a home. That night, as the stew simmered and filled the cabin with smells Jack hadn't experienced in years, Caleb descended from the loft. He didn't apologize, but his hostility had diminished to something more manageable. He set the table without being asked, a small gesture that Eleanor acknowledged with a nod. They ate together, the four of them around the table. The stew tasted like memory, like Sunday dinners, and family gathered together. Eleanor had gotten it exactly right, following Margaret's instructions down to the extra pinch of thyme. "This is really good, Mum," Owen said. Even Caleb nodded. "Yeah, it's good." After dinner, as they cleaned up together in the small kitchen, Eleanor found herself standing at the window. The storm showed no signs of abating, snow driving horizontally across the clearing. She caught movement at the tree-lined shadows, indistinct but present. "Dad," she said carefully, "is something out there?" Jack joined her at the window, peering into the darkness. For a moment he saw nothing, then there. A flash of white against the darker forest, gone almost before it registered. "Probably just the greys," he said, but uncertainty crept into his voice. The greys were grey, as their name suggested. That flash had been white. "The wolves you mentioned?" "Yeah." He watched the tree line more carefully now, looking for movement. "They usually stay well away from the cabin, though." Another flash, this time closer, and another from a different direction. Jack's instincts, honed by decades in the wilderness, sent a warning. "Everyone away from the windows," he said quietly. Eleanor heard the change in his tone. "What's wrong?" "Probably nothing. But let's not take chances." He moved to the rifle above the door, checked that it was loaded. Not pointing it at anything, just having it ready. Caleb and Owen had gone still, sensing the shift in atmosphere. "Are we in danger?" Caleb asked. his earlier bravado replaced by genuine concern. "We're fine," Jack assured him, "just being cautious." But outside, in the storm, shapes moved with purpose and intelligence, not the greys he knew, but something else, something larger, whiter, more numerous. They circled the clearing in patterns that spoke of coordination and intent. Jack stood at the window long after the others had gone to bed, watching shadows that might be wolves or might be tricks of storm and darkness. His hand rested on the rifle stock, ready but not threatening. Whatever was out there, whatever had come with the storm, it was assessing them just as surely as they were trying to assess it. And Jack couldn't shake the feeling that the wilderness, which had been his companion and teacher for decades, had just introduced a new lesson. One he wasn't sure he was ready to learn. The storm broke on the fourth morning, leaving the world crystalline and impossibly bright. Jack ventured out at first light, his boots crunching through 2 feet of fresh snow. The air was so cold it burned his lungs, and his breath emerged in thick clouds that hung motionless in the still air. He wasn't 10 feet from the cabin when he found the first tracks. They were massive, easily twice the size of the prints the greys left. The stride length suggested an animal of considerable size and power. Jack knelt, examining the impression carefully. 4 distinct toe pads, claws visible in the snow. Definitely wolf, but larger than any he'd encountered in his decades here. He followed the tracks around the perimeter of the clearing. They circled the cabin in a deliberate pattern, multiple animals moving in coordination. He counted at least 8 distinct trails, possibly more where tracks overlapped. The pack had spent hours out here during the storm, studying his home, assessing the situation. At the edge of the forest, the tracks converged and headed northeast. Jack followed cautiously, rifle slung across his back, moving through snow that reached his knees. After a quarter mile, he found what he'd feared, a kill site. A bull moose lay collapsed near the frozen creek, its throat torn open, snow around it stained dark. The carcass was mostly intact, which meant the kill was recent. Jack studied the scene with a tracker's eye, reading the story written in blood and churned snow. The moose had been driven toward the creek, where the ice was thin and treacherous. It had broken through, struggled, been pulled down by multiple wolves working together. Efficient, coordinated hunting that spoke of experience and intelligence. But what troubled Jack most was the evidence of feeding. The wolves had eaten, but not much, just enough to take the edge off. Hunger, the bulk of the carcass remained, which meant they planned to return, which meant they were establishing this area as their territory, which meant Jack's cabin sat in the middle of their new hunting ground. He returned to find his family waking, the smell of coffee filling the cabin. Eleanor was at the stove, attempting pancakes from a mix she'd found in the pantry. The boys sat at the table, Owen sketching in his notebook, Caleb staring at nothing with the 1,000-yard stare of a teenager forced into consciousness too early. "You were up early," Eleanor observed as Jack stamped snow from his boots. "Needed to check something." He hung his coat, moved to the coffee pot. "We have a situation." That got everyone's attention. Even Caleb looked up, sleep temporarily forgotten. Jack explained what he'd found, the tracks, their size, the kill site. He kept his voice calm, factual, not wanting to alarm them, but needing them to understand the reality of their circumstances. "So there are bigger wolves out here now?" Owen asked, fascination overcoming fear. "Not just bigger. Different pack entirely. White wolves, from the look of the fur I found snagged on branches, rare this far south." Eleanor's nursing instincts kicked in, assessing threats and risks. "Are we in danger?" "Hard to say. They're clearly interested in this area, but whether that includes us as threats or prey," he shrugged. "Too early to tell." "So what do we do?" Caleb's voice had lost its confrontational edge, replaced by something closer to respect for the gravity of the situation. "We prepare, secure the perimeter, ration supplies more carefully, keep watch at night." Jack drank his coffee, considering. "I'll radio Hank, see if he can come early with the next supply run." Might be best to get you three out of here before things get complicated. No. Eleanor's response was immediate and firm. We're not running again. We just got here. This isn't running. It's being smart. We're staying. She met his eyes with a stubbornness he recognized from Margaret. Unless you're ordering us to leave? Jack wanted to argue, wanted to insist on their safety above all else. But he also understood pride, understood the need to stand your ground. He'd spent a decade doing exactly that. We stay together then, he said finally. But everyone follows my lead on security. No arguments, no debates. Agreed? 3 nods, even from Caleb. They spent the morning fortifying the cabin. Jack showed the boys how to stack firewood closer to the door, creating barriers that would slow any approach. He checked the shutters, reinforced them with additional lumber. He moved his cache of emergency supplies inside, not wanting to risk an outdoor trip if things turned dangerous. Caleb, surprisingly, threw himself into the work with genuine effort. He was strong for 16, capable of hauling wood and hammering nails without complaint. Jack found himself working alongside his grandson, their movements gradually synchronizing as they fell into rhythm. "You know what you're doing," Caleb observed, driving a nail with 3 precise strikes. "Had to learn. Out here, preparation isn't optional. My dad never taught me anything like this. He was always—" Caleb stopped, jaw tightening. He was always too busy. Jack recognized the pain beneath the anger. "Your father made his choices. You'll make yours. They don't have to be the same. Mom says you weren't around much either. After Grandma died." The observation landed with the precision of an arrow. Jack set down his hammer, looked at his grandson directly. "Your mother's right. I failed your mother and uncle when they needed me most. I let grief turn me selfish and small." Caleb hadn't expected honesty. He stood uncertain, hammer dangling from his hand. "But I'm here now," Jack continued. "Can't change the past, but I can choose what happens next. Same as you, same as everyone." They worked in silence after that, but something had shifted between them. Not forgiveness that took time, but perhaps the first seed of understanding. Afternoon brought Owen outside with questions about the tracks. Jack walked him to the tree line, showing him how to read sign, how to distinguish wolf from coyote, fresh from old. The boy absorbed information like a sponge, asking intelligent questions, making connections Jack hadn't expected. They circled the cabin 7 times, Owen observed, studying the overlapping trails. Why 7? Learning the space, looking for weaknesses, escape routes, defensive positions. Like a military operation. Jack smiled slightly. Exactly like that. Wolves are natural tacticians. They have to be, or they don't eat. Are you scared of them? The question was direct, innocent. Jack considered lying, offering false bravado. But Owen deserved honesty. "I'm cautious. Fear and caution aren't the same thing. Fear makes you stupid. Caution keeps you alive. Which one makes you brave?" "Neither. Bravery is being afraid and doing what needs doing anyway." They returned to the cabin as the sun began its early descent. Eleanor had soup ready, another recipe from Margaret's box. They ate together, conversation flowing more easily now. Even Caleb participated, telling a story about a camping trip with his scout troop that had gone comically wrong. Jack listened, adding occasional comments, feeling something unfamiliar and uncomfortable in his chest. It took him a while to recognize it, contentment mixed with anxiety. Having people to protect meant having something to lose. He'd forgotten how terrifying that could be. As darkness fell, they heard it, the howling. But it wasn't the familiar song of the Greys. This was different, higher-pitched, more voices singing together in eerie harmony. Jack moved to the window. Shapes moved at the clearing's edge, white against the darkening forest. He counted 5, 6, 7 distinct forms, more than he'd estimated from the tracks. The Alpha stepped into view, massive and pale, its coat gleaming in the failing light. It looked directly at the cabin, at the windows where warm light glowed. For a long moment it stood there, assessing. Then it turned and led the pack back into the forest. Eleanor stood beside Jack, her hand finding his arm. They know we're here. They've always known. Now they're deciding what to do about it. And us? She asked quietly. What are we deciding? Jack watched the trees where the wolves had disappeared, thinking about choices and consequences, about standing ground versus knowing when to retreat. We're deciding the same thing they are. How far we'll go to protect what matters. Outside, the wolves continued their song, marking territory and making intentions known. Inside, a family gathered closer, united by danger and the slow rebuilding of trust. Morning brought the kind of stillness that precedes major weather changes. Jack woke early, his internal alarm calibrated by decades of reading the wilderness. The air felt heavy, pregnant with the promise of another storm. The second front Hank had warned about was arriving ahead of schedule. He dressed quietly and descended from the loft where he'd been sleeping, careful not to wake Eleanor on the couch below. She'd insisted he'd take his bed back after the first night, but he'd refused. Some gestures mattered more than comfort. The radio crackled to life at 6:30, Hank's voice breaking through static. "Jack, you reading me? I'm here. That front's coming in fast. 12 hours, maybe less. You prepared? As much as I can be. The wolf situation is escalating." "Yeah, about that." Hank's voice grew serious. Fish and Wildlife sent out an advisory. They've been tracking that white pack, displaced by the fires up north, pushed into unfamiliar territory. They're not naturally aggressive, but hunger makes animals unpredictable. Jack absorbed this information, pieces clicking together. How long have they been tracking them? Couple weeks. Lost the signal during that first storm. They're planning a relocation effort once weather permits, tranquilize and move them back north where their territory is. When? 2, 3 days if this front passes quick. Week if it doesn't. Static crackled. You need an extraction. I can try to get in before the storm hits. Jack glanced at Eleanor, still sleeping, then up at the loft where his grandsons lay. The old Jack would have said yes, immediately, gotten them out, returned to his comfortable solitude. But something had shifted in the past week. Some door had opened that couldn't easily close again. "We'll ride it out," he said finally, "but keep the line open. Things change, I'll let you know." "Your call, Jack. Be safe." The radio went silent. Jack stood for a moment, coffee cup warming his hands, wondering if he'd just made a terrible mistake. Outside, the first clouds were gathering, dark and ominous on the northern horizon. Eleanor stirred, opened her eyes. For a moment she looked confused, then memory returned, and her expression settled into something resigned but determined. "Morning," she said, sitting up. "I heard voices. Hank, storm's coming." Jack poured her coffee, handed it over. "He offered to extract you and the boys before it hits." She wrapped her hands around the cup, met his eyes. "You said no. I said we'd decide together. Then we stay. We're not running from weather or wolves or anything else." She drank, grimaced at the strength. "How bad is it going to be?" "Well, you have one dayed and one dayed, one dayed and one. Bad enough. 3-4 days trapped inside, at minimum. We'll manage." "We did before." Caleb descended the ladder, followed by Owen. Both boys looked more comfortable than they had a week ago, moving through the space with growing familiarity. Caleb had even stopped complaining about the lack of internet, though Jack suspected that was more resignation than acceptance. "I'm going to fortify defenses before the storm hits," Jack announced. "Caleb, I need your help. Owen, you're on wood detail, stack as much as you can fit on the porch. Eleanor, inventory food and water. If we're stuck inside for 4 days, I want to know exactly what we're working with." They moved to their tasks without argument, a team operating with surprising efficiency. Jack and Caleb worked outside, building improvised barriers and checking the structural integrity of the cabin. The temperature was already dropping, wind picking up in gusts that sent snow devils spinning across the clearing. They were securing the final shutter when Caleb stopped, his attention fixed on something in the distance. "Grandpa, look." Jack turned. At the tree line, barely visible, stood several white shapes, the wolf pack, watching them work. The alpha was in front, massive and regal, its pale coat making it seem almost spectral against the darker forest. "How many are there?" Caleb asked, voice hushed. Jack counted quickly. 8, visible, could be more in the trees. Why are they just watching? Same reason we're watching them, trying to figure out if we're a threat or just part of the landscape. The alpha took several steps forward, closing the distance to perhaps 50 yards. Jack's hand moved instinctively toward his rifle, but he stopped himself. No aggressive posture, no threat display, just readiness. "Don't run," Jack said quietly. "Don't make sudden movements. Just stand still and let them look." They stood together, grandfather and grandson, while the wolf pack assessed them. It felt like an eternity, but was probably only 2 minutes. Then the alpha huffed a sound like expelled breath and turned back toward the forest. The pack followed, melting into the trees like smoke. "That was incredible," Caleb breathed. "I've never seen anything like that." Most people don't. Wolves usually avoid humans. These ones, Jack paused considering, they're in a tough spot. Desperate animals make different choices than comfortable ones. They finished the fortifications and went inside as the first snow began to fall. Eleanor had completed her inventory. The results spread across the table. "We have enough for 2 weeks if we're careful," she reported. 3 if we stretch it. "The storm won't last that long." Jack studied her notes, impressed by her thoroughness. "But good to know we have margin." Owen had stacked enough wood to build a small house, his efforts enthusiastic if not always efficient. Jack helped him reorganize the pile, showing him how to stack for stability and airflow. The boy soaked up instruction like dry ground accepts rain. By midday, the storm had arrived in earnest. Wind howled around the cabin, driving snow in horizontal sheets that obliterated visibility beyond 10 feet. They were sealed in again, but this time felt different. They'd chosen to stay together, chosen to face whatever came as a unit rather than individuals seeking separate safety. Afternoon stretched into evening, time marked by the progression of simple tasks: cooking, cleaning, carving, reading. Eleanor found a box of books in the corner, old paperbacks that Margaret had collected. She read aloud while the others worked, her voice filling the space with stories of adventure and distant places. Jack listened while carving, his hands working independently of his conscious thought. The wolf was nearly complete now, its form elegant and powerful. Owen watched his technique, trying to replicate it on his own smaller piece. "You're good at this," Owen observed. "Have you ever sold them?" "No. Never saw the point. But they're beautiful. People would pay for them." Jack shrugged. "Money's not why I carve. I do it because it settles my mind, gives my hands something to do besides worry." "What do you worry about?" The question was innocent, but it cut deep. Jack set down his knife, looked at his grandson properly. "I used to worry about being alone. Now I worry about the people I care about. It's a different kind of worry, but maybe a better one." Eleanor stopped reading, looked up from her book. Their eyes met across the room, understanding passing between them without words. That night, as the storm raged and the cabin creaked under wind pressure, they heard the wolves again. The howling was closer than before, multiple voices rising and falling in complex harmonies. Jack stood at the window, trying to see through the storm, catching only occasional glimpses of pale shapes moving through the darkness. "They're hunting," he said quietly. "Storm drives prey into the open, makes them vulnerable." Eleanor joined him, her reflection ghostly in the window glass. "Will they come here?" "Not yet. They have easier options. But if they get desperate enough..." He left the thought unfinished. She rested her hand on his arm, a gesture that would have been impossible a week ago. "We'll handle it. Whatever comes, we'll handle it together." Jack nodded, though doubt gnawed at him. The wolves were magnificent, powerful, survivors doing what they must. His family was equally vulnerable, equally deserving of protection. If it came to a choice, if the situation forced his hand, what would he do? Outside, the alpha's howl rose above the others, a sound of command and determination. Jack recognized something in that voice, something that mirrored his own resolve. They were both old males protecting their packs, both willing to face whatever came next. The question was whether there was enough room in this wilderness for both families to survive. Jack woke to pre-dawn darkness, his internal clock insisting something was wrong. He lay still on the couch, listening past the storm's diminished howl, trying to identify what had triggered his alarm. Then he heard movement outside, deliberate and coordinated, multiple shapes passing near the cabin walls. He rose silently, moved to the window. The storm had weakened enough to allow visibility, and what he saw made his breath catch. The white wolves were everywhere, a dozen or more surrounding the cabin in a loose perimeter. They weren't threatening, weren't approaching the structure, but their presence was impossible to miss. The alpha stood at the clearing's center, facing the cabin. Even at 50 yards, Jack could see the animal's ribs through its fur, could read the desperation in its posture. These weren't invaders, they were refugees, pushed to the edge of survival. The radio crackled unexpectedly, making Jack jump. He crossed to it quickly, keying the microphone before it could wake the others. "Go ahead." "Jack, it's Hank. Got urgent information about those wolves." Static filled the pause, then Hank's voice returned, broken but clear enough. "Fish and Wildlife finally got full intel. That pack, they're not just displaced. Forest fire burned through their entire territory 2 months ago. They've been pushed south, starving, losing ground to other packs." Jack watched the alpha through the window as Hank continued. "There's more. Wildlife officer spotted a nursing female 3 weeks ago. That means pups somewhere, young enough they can't travel. Packs trapped here can't relocate until the young ones are mobile." Understanding crashed through Jack like cold water. The aggression, the territorial behavior, the constant presence, it wasn't about claiming his land. It was about protecting something infinitely more precious and vulnerable. "Where's the den?" Jack asked. "Unknown." Officer lost visual before he could track them. "But Jack, here's the critical part." More static, then Hank's voice emerged, urgent and clear. "Relocation teams coming in 36 hours. They'll tranquilize the whole pack, move them north. But in this cold, with animals this stressed and undernourished, tranquilizers could be fatal. And if there are pups separated from the pack, they'll die," Jack finished. "Yeah, Wildlife Services don't know about the pups yet. I thought you should know before they get here. Maybe you can—" The transmission dissolved into static, then nothing. Jack stood holding the dead microphone, his mind racing through implications and possibilities. The wolves weren't his enemy. They were doing exactly what he was doing, protecting family at any cost. And the authorities, well-meaning but operating on incomplete information, were about to destroy what they were trying to save. "What's going on?" Eleanor's voice came from behind him, sleep-rough but alert. Jack turned to find his whole family awake, watching him with various expressions of concern. He'd failed to keep his voice down, had woken them with his conversation. No point hiding the truth now. He told them everything: the fire, the displacement, the nursing female, the pups, the relocation team. He explained the risk of tranquilizers, the likelihood that aggressive intervention would fragment the pack and doom the young. Owen was the first to speak, his voice awed. "There are babies out there?" "Somewhere, yes. Den hidden well enough, the wildlife officers couldn't find it." Eleanor moved to the window, looking out at the wolves surrounding their cabin. "They're not here to threaten us. They're here because the den must be nearby, and they're protecting it. That's my guess." Caleb crossed his arms, his pragmatic nature asserting itself. "So what? That's not our problem. We wait for the wildlife people, they move the wolves. We're safe. Everyone wins. Except the wolves don't win, Owen countered. If the tranquilizers kill them, or if the pups get left behind. That's nature. Survival of the fittest. Jack interrupted the brewing argument. It's not that simple. These wolves were driven from their home by human activity. The fire started from a lightning strike, but we're the ones who've altered the forests, changed the fuel loads, made fires burn hotter and longer. We're part of the problem. So what are you suggesting? Eleanor asked, though from her tone Jack suspected she already knew. I want to find the den, verify the pups are there and healthy. If I can document their location and condition, maybe convince the wildlife team there's a better option than full relocation. That's insane, Caleb said flatly. Those wolves will kill you. Maybe. Or maybe they'll understand I'm not a threat to what they're protecting. Eleanor studied her father's face, reading the determination there. This is about more than wolves, isn't it? Jack met her eyes, saw understanding reflected there. I spent 10 years choosing the safe path. Chose isolation because it was easier than risking connection. These wolves are risking everything for their family. Seems like I should be willing to do the same. Silence filled the cabin, broken only by wind and the settling of logs in the stove. Owen moved to stand beside Jack, looking out at the wolves. I want to help. No. Too dangerous. But. No, Jack repeated, firmer this time. What I'm proposing is risky enough for one person. I won't put you in that position. Eleanor made a decision, her nurse's training and mother's instinct finding common ground. If you're doing this, you're not going unprepared. We document everything. We have a safety plan. And if things go wrong... She stopped, gathered herself. If things go wrong, we need to be ready to defend ourselves. Agreed. They spent the next hour planning. Jack would approach the wolves at first light, using body language and positioning to signal non-aggression. He'd carry no weapons, just a torch fire was something wolves understood and respected. Eleanor prepared a basic medical kit from her nursing supplies, though what good it would do against a wolf attack was questionable. Caleb remained skeptical but helped prepare anyway, his actions speaking louder than his doubts. Owen loaded the Polaroid camera, determined to document whatever happened. As dawn approached, the storm finally broke. Clear sky emerged, stars fading into the approaching sunrise. The wolves remained at their positions, patient and watchful. Jack, dressed in layers, secured the torch and supplies. At the door, he paused, looking at his family gathered around him. Eleanor's face was tight with worry. Owen looked excited and terrified in equal measure. Even Caleb's skepticism had softened into reluctant concern. "I'll be back," Jack said simply. Eleanor stepped forward, pulled him into a hug, the first physical affection between them in 7 years. "You better be. We just found you again." Jack held his daughter, feeling the years of distance collapse into this single moment. Then he released her, nodded to his grandsons, and stepped out into the cold morning air. The alpha wolf was waiting 20 yards from the cabin, as if it had been expecting him. Their eyes met across the distance, and Jack saw recognition there, not of him as an individual, but as another creature making impossible choices for the sake of family. He took a step forward. The alpha didn't retreat or advance, simply watched. Jack took another step, then another, moving with deliberate slowness. Behind him, his family watched from the window. Ahead, the wolf pack waited to decide if he was friend or threat. And somewhere in the forest, hidden and vulnerable, pups depended on decisions being made in this frozen moment. Jack raised the torch, its flame bright against the snow. The alpha tilted its head, considering. Then, with a movement that seemed almost ceremonial, it turned and began walking toward the tree line. An invitation, or a test, perhaps both. Jack followed, knowing that whatever happened next would define not just his relationship with these wolves, but with his family and himself. The wilderness, as always, demanded honesty. Time to see if he had any left to give. The alpha led Jack through dense spruce forest, moving with confidence born of intimate territorial knowledge. The other wolves flanked them at a distance, not threatening but present an escort rather than an attack formation. Jack kept his breathing steady, his movements deliberate and non-aggressive. His grandfather's compass hung around his neck, the brass cold against his chest through layers of clothing. He pulled it out periodically, marking their direction. Northeast, consistently northeast, deeper into terrain he knew but had rarely traveled. The forest here was older, the trees massive and ancient, their branches forming a canopy that blocked much of the sky. After 20 minutes of steady walking, his legs burning from the effort of moving through deep snow, the alpha stopped. They'd reached an outcropping of granite that thrust up through the forest floor like broken bones. At its base, partially hidden by fallen timber and accumulated snow, was a cave entrance. The alpha looked at Jack, then at the cave, then back. The message was unmistakable. This is what we protect. Jack approached slowly, torch held low to provide light without threatening. He knelt at the cave entrance, peering into darkness. Movement caught his eye, small shapes tumbling over each other, curious about the visitor. Pups, 5 of them, maybe 6 weeks old. Their eyes were open, their movements coordinated but clumsy in the way of young things, still learning their bodies. One pup, smaller than the others, struggled to join its siblings. Its left rear leg bent at an unnatural angle, clearly broken. The injury was recent enough that the pup still tried to use it, whimpering with each failed attempt to put weight on the damaged limb. Jack's chest tightened. This was why the pack couldn't move, why they'd been so aggressive in defending this area. The injured pup couldn't travel, and wolves don't abandon their young. They were trapped here by love and loyalty, forced to defend territory they hadn't chosen against threats they couldn't avoid. He backed away from the den slowly, respecting the space. The alpha watched him, those ancient gold eyes assessing his every movement. Jack spoke quietly, knowing the wolf wouldn't understand words, but hoping tone would carry meaning. I see now. I understand what you're fighting for. The alpha's ears twitched forward, listening. I have family too, people I'd die to protect. We're not so different, you and I. Jack reached into his pack, pulled out dried meat he'd brought as an offering. He placed it in the snow, then backed away several steps. The gesture was symbolic. He understood these wolves were capable hunters, but symbols mattered. This was tribute, recognition of their territory and their right to it. Younger wolves moved forward eagerly, drawn by hunger, but the alpha stopped them with a low growl. He approached the meat himself, sniffed it carefully, then allowed the others to take it. They fell on the offering with the desperation of creatures who'd been hungry too long. The alpha didn't eat. He continued watching Jack, reading his intent with the clarity of a predator who'd survived by understanding threats. After a long moment, the wolf's posture shifted, not submission, but acceptance. A tentative truce, offered and acknowledged. Jack was about to begin his return journey when he heard it, the distinctive thrum of helicopter rotors, distant but approaching. His heart sank. Hank had said 36 hours. Either the timeline had been wrong, or he'd miscalculated how long he'd been in the forest. The wolves heard it too. The pack's energy shifted immediately, defensive instincts flaring. The alpha's hackles rose, and the other adults moved to protect the den entrance. They'd been hunted before, Jack realized. They knew what helicopters meant. He had minutes at most before the wildlife team arrived. Not enough time to get back to the cabin, not enough to explain the situation properly. He had to make a choice: retreat to safety, or stand here and try to protect the pack from well-meaning intervention that could destroy them. Jack made his decision. He positioned himself between the den and the approaching sound, torch still lit, stance non-aggressive but immovable. If the wildlife team wanted to tranquilize these wolves, they'd have to go through him first. The alpha moved to stand beside him, not behind, not in front, but beside. equal partners in defense of the vulnerable. The other wolves formed up around them, a united front against the incoming threat. The helicopter appeared over the tree line, circling once before, finding a clearing 50 yards away. Jack watched it land, saw two figures emerge. He recognized the lead officer immediately, Stan Kowalski, a man he'd worked with years ago on various wildlife issues. If he had to face anyone from Fish and Wildlife, Stan was probably the best option. Stan and his partner approached cautiously, the partner carrying a tranquilizer rifle. They stopped when they saw Jack standing with the wolves, confusion clear on both faces. "Jack Merrow," Stan called out. "What in God's name are you doing?" "Preventing a mistake," Jack called back. "These wolves aren't the threat you think they are. Need you to step away from them. Not safe where you're standing. I'm exactly where I need to be." Jack held his ground. "Stan, they've got pups. Den's right here. One's injured. Can't travel. You tranquilize this pack. You're signing death warrants." Stan stopped, processing this information. His partner, younger and clearly following protocol over judgment, kept the rifle raised. "Sir, our orders are clear. Pack needs to be relocated." "Your orders are based on incomplete information," Jack countered. "Give me 5 minutes to show you what's really happening here." The Alpha growled low, responding to the tension in the air. The pack tightened their formation, ready to defend their young against any threat. Jack could feel the situation balanced on a knife's edge. One wrong move, one misunderstood gesture, and violence would erupt. Stan made a decision. "Lower your weapon, Brooks. Nobody's shooting anybody right now." He turned to Jack. 5 minutes. Show me what you're talking about." Jack carefully gestured toward the den. "There are 5 pups in that cave. One has a broken leg. This pack can't relocate, can't abandon the injured pup, can't defend themselves against tranquilizers in their current condition. You go through with standard protocol, you'll kill them all. We have procedures for injured animals. Your procedures work fine for healthy, well-fed wildlife. These wolves have been starving for weeks, stressed beyond normal parameters. Tranquilizers will suppress their breathing, drop their body temperature. In this cold, weakened as they are, they won't wake up." Stan studied Jack's face, then looked at the wolves, then at the den entrance. Years of experience fought with official protocols in his expression. "You're asking me to violate direct orders. I'm asking you to use your judgment. You've been doing this long enough to know when protocol doesn't fit the situation." The younger officer, Brooks, spoke up. "We can't just leave an aggressive pack near an occupied cabin. Civilian safety has to come first." "They're not aggressive," Jack said firmly. "They're protective. There's a difference. And I'm the civilian you're worried about. I'm telling you we can coexist." The Alpha, perhaps sensing the shift in dynamic, took a calculated risk. It moved toward the den entrance, looked back at Jack and Stan, then disappeared inside. Moments later it emerged, carrying the injured pup gently in its mouth. The pup whimpered, and the sound carried clearly in the cold air. The Alpha placed the pup in the snow between itself and the humans. The gesture was unmistakable. "Look, see what we protect, understand what you threaten." Stan knelt slowly, examining the pup from a distance. Even from where Jack stood, he could see the officer's expression soften. "Damn," Stan said quietly. "That's a fresh break. Few days old at most." "Can't move with that injury," Jack said. "Not without killing it." Stan rose slowly from examining the injured pup, his face troubled. The Alpha carefully retrieved its offspring, carrying it back to the den with the tenderness of any parent protecting wounded young. The other wolves maintained their defensive positions, wary but no longer openly threatening. "This changes things," Stan admitted. "Brooks, radio headquarters, tell them we need to delay the relocation operation." Brooks lowered his rifle, but his expression remained skeptical. "On what grounds?" On the grounds that I'm the senior wildlife officer here, and I'm making a field decision based on circumstances that weren't in our briefing. Stan's voice carried authority, born of decades in the cot field. Tell them we've discovered a den with injured pups and we need medical assessment before proceeding. While Brooks moved away to make the call, Stan approached Jack more closely. The wolves tensed but didn't advance, reading the change in energy. You've got one hell of a story to explain, Merrow. When did you become the Wolf Whisperer? About 20 minutes ago. Jack allowed himself a slight smile. Didn't plan this, Stan. Just saw a situation that needed a different approach than the official one. You know I'm going out on a limb here. Headquarters won't be happy about the delay. I know, and I appreciate it. Stan looked at the wolves, then back at Jack. You really think you can monitor them? Keep them from becoming a problem? I think we've already established an understanding. They know I'm not a threat to their young. That counts for something in their world. And when the pups are mobile, when the pack needs to expand their hunting range, Jack had been thinking about this during the long walk to the den. There's old forest land north of my property, uninhabited, good prey base. If we can create a protected corridor, give them safe passage to better territory without forcing full relocation, you're talking about a long-term management solution. That requires documentation, regular monitoring, official approval. Then let's document it. I've got a camera. I can take photos. My daughter's a nurse. She can assess the pup's injury properly, help develop a treatment plan. Stan considered this, weighing regulations against common sense. Brooks returned, shaking his head. Headquarters wants confirmation of den location and pup status before they'll consider any delays. Then, that's what we'll give them. Stan pulled out his own camera, began taking photos of the den site, the pack, the surrounding terrain. Jack, I need you to sign paperwork assuming responsibility for this pack. Any incidents, any problems, it falls on you. You understand? Completely. And I need regular reports, weekly minimum, daily if possible. Pups' recovery, pack behavior, any changes in the situation. You'll have them. Brooks remained unconvinced. This is highly irregular. We're setting precedent here that could complicate future operations. Future operations will have better information because we're taking time to do this right, Stan countered. Now help me document everything before this weather turns again. They spent the next hour conducting a thorough assessment. Stan examined the den from a respectful distance, noting the pack's defensive but not aggressive behavior. He photographed the injured pup when the alpha brought it out again, documenting the break's angle and severity. Jack watched the wolves throughout the process, noting how they responded to each movement and sound. The alpha maintained its position between the humans and the den, but its hackles gradually lowered. The pack was learning, adjusting, understanding that this intrusion wasn't the same as previous threats. Eleanor appeared at the edge of the clearing, Owen and Caleb behind her. She'd clearly decided waiting in the cabin was unacceptable. She approached cautiously, her nursing bag slung over her shoulder. I heard helicopters, she said. Figured you might need help. Stan raised an eyebrow. And you are? Eleanor Harris. Jack's daughter. I'm a registered nurse. She looked at the pup the alpha was holding. That's the injured one? Broken leg, few days old, Stan confirmed. You have experience with animal injuries? Some, mostly domestic, but basic principles are the same. She turned to Jack. Can I examine it? Jack looked at the alpha, who watched Eleanor with the same intense assessment it had given Jack. Slowly, let him see you're not a threat. Eleanor approached with the confidence of someone accustomed to working with frightened patients. She knelt in the snow, opened her bag to show its contents, bandages, splints, antiseptic. She spoke in a low, calm voice, the same tone she'd use with a child in pain. I just want to help. That leg needs to be set properly, or it won't heal right. The alpha tilted its head, processing tone and body language. After a long moment, It took several steps forward and gently placed the pup in the snow between itself and Eleanor. Permission granted, tentatively, and with clear warning that any harm would be answered. Eleanor examined the pup with practiced efficiency. Clean break of the tibia displaced. If it sets wrong, the pup will be permanently lame. She looked up at Stan. I can splint it here, but it needs to stay on for at least 3 weeks. Someone will have to monitor it. That would be me, Jack said. Stan was already taking photos, documenting everything. This is unprecedented. You realize that? Good, Owen spoke up unexpectedly. Everyone turned to look at the teenager who held the Polaroid camera Jack had given him. Sometimes precedents need to be set. Sometimes the old ways don't work anymore, and someone has to try something new. Caleb stood beside his brother, less enthusiastic but present. For what it's worth, which probably isn't much, I think Grandpa's right. These wolves aren't the enemy. They're just trying to survive, same as anyone. Stan studied the boys, then Jack, then Eleanor, preparing her supplies. You've got quite a family here, Merrow. All right, let's do this properly. Eleanor, if you can splint that pup, I'll document the procedure. Jack, you're signing official paperwork as soon as we're done here. And all of you, he looked at each of them in turn. You're committing to something that's going to require dedication, patience, and probably more courage than you realize. Still in? 4 voices answered in unison. Yes. Then let's make history. Brooks, get all of this on video. Headquarters will want every detail. As Eleanor began the delicate work of setting the pup's leg, the alpha, watching every movement with laser focus, Jack felt something shift fundamentally in his chest. This family he'd pushed away, these wolves he'd feared, this wilderness he'd used as a fortress, all of it was connected, all of it mattered. He'd spent 10 years choosing solitude over risk, safety over connection. Now, standing in snow with wolves and family surrounding him, he understood what Margaret had tried to teach him all along. The only real safety came from choosing to protect what mattered, regardless of the cost. The pup whimpered as Eleanor worked, but the alpha remained still, trusting in ways that wolves rarely trust. And Jack, watching his daughter heal while his grandsons documented and wildlife officers recorded, felt something he hadn't experienced in a decade. Hope. Fragile and tentative, but undeniably real. Eleanor's hands moved with practiced precision, feeling along the pup's small leg to locate the exact position of the break. The pup whimpered and tried to squirm, but Jack held it gently, his weathered hands surprisingly tender. The alpha stood 3 feet away, every muscle tensed, golden eyes tracking Eleanor's every movement. On 3, Eleanor said, positioning her hands. 1, 2. She reset the bone on 2, the old medical trick catching the pup off guard. The pup yelped sharply, struggling against Jack's hold. The alpha lunged forward, hackles raised, protective instinct overriding the fragile trust they'd built. Jack didn't flinch. It's all right. She's helping. Look, she's helping. The alpha stopped inches away, torn between aggression and understanding. Eleanor worked quickly, wrapping the splint with efficient movements, securing it with tape and gauze. The entire procedure took less than 4 minutes, but each second felt stretched and precarious. Done, Eleanor announced, releasing the pup carefully. The splint needs to stay on for 3 weeks minimum. No exceptions. Jack set the pup down gently. It stumbled, testing its new constraint, then managed to stand on 3 legs. The alpha immediately moved in, sniffing its offspring thoroughly, checking for damage beyond what it could see. Satisfied, it picked up the pup and carried it back toward the den. At the entrance, the alpha paused and looked back at Eleanor and Jack. Something in that gaze had changed, not friendship, exactly, but recognition. Acknowledgement of a debt, owed and understood. Stan captured the moment on camera. That's going in the report. Nobody at headquarters will believe it without photos. He turned to Jack. You understand what you've committed to? 3 weeks of monitoring at minimum. Daily checks to ensure that splint stays on and the leg heals properly. I understand, and if the pack shows any aggression toward you or your family, then we reassess. But I don't think we'll have that problem. Brooks, who'd been filming everything, finally lowered his camera. I'll admit, I didn't think this would work. Still not sure it will long term, but... He shrugged. Maybe I'm wrong. Hope you are, Stan said, because if this works, it could change how we handle displaced predator populations. He pulled out paperwork from his pack, spread it on a flat rock. Jack, I need your signature here, here, and here. You're officially assuming guardianship responsibility for this pack. Any incidents involving them become your legal liability. Jack signed without hesitation, his signature bold despite the cold, making his hands stiff. Eleanor signed as well, adding her nursing credentials to the documentation. Stan gathered the papers, tucked them away carefully. We'll return in 3 days to assess progress. In the meantime, radio if there are any problems. And I mean any problems, aggressive behavior, the pup's condition worsening, anything. Understood. The helicopter lifted off 20 minutes later, leaving the clearing quiet except for wind and the distant sounds of the pack settling near their den. Jack and his family stood together, watching until the aircraft disappeared over the tree line. Did we really just do that? Caleb asked, wonder replacing his usual skepticism. We did, Eleanor confirmed. Now comes the hard part, following through. They made their way back to the cabin, the pack trailing at a distance, but no longer hiding. The Alpha walked parallel to them, maintaining respectful separation, but clearly escorting them through what it still considered its territory. The message was clear. Partnership didn't mean submission. Back at the cabin, Eleanor inventoried her remaining medical supplies. I used most of my splinting materials. We'll need more if anything else happens. Add it to the list for Hank's next supply run, Jack said. He moved to the radio, keyed the microphone. Hank, you reading? Static then. Jack, what the hell happened? I saw the wildlife helicopter heading your way. Jack explained the situation, the den discovery, Stan's assessment, the agreement they'd reached. Hank listened in silence, occasionally making sounds that could have been disbelief or admiration. So you're a wolf guardian now, Hank said finally. Never thought I'd see the day. You need anything? Medical supplies. Eleanor will give you a list. And Hank, thanks for the heads up about the pups. Made all the difference. Just doing my job. You're the one who walked out to face them. That took guts or stupidity, maybe both. Probably both, Jack agreed. I'll radio tomorrow with an update. The afternoon passed in a strange new rhythm. They prepared dinner together, the cabin filling with the smell of venison stew and fresh bread. Owen showed Jack his photographs, dozens of shots documenting the morning's events, including one perfect image of the Alpha standing beside Jack, both of them facing the approaching helicopter. This one, Owen said, holding up the photo, this is the one people need to see. Jack studied the image. 2 old males, human and wolf, united in protection of the vulnerable. It told the whole story in a single frame. Make sure that goes in the official record. Stan will want it. As darkness fell, they heard the familiar howling, but the tone had changed. The pack wasn't warning off intruders anymore. They were singing to each other, maintaining bonds, celebrating survival. The injured pup's voice, high and uncertain, joined the chorus, alive and healing. Eleanor stood at the window beside Jack, listening. You know this is going to change everything. We can't just leave after this. The wolves need consistent monitoring. I know. The boys need stability, need to finish their school year. I know that too. She turned to face him directly. I'm saying we might stay, long term, maybe permanently. Would that be all right with you? Jack felt emotion tighten his throat. 10 years of solitude, of careful isolation, of protecting himself from loss by refusing connection. And now his daughter was offering to stay, to rebuild what he'd broken, to create something new from the ruins of their family. More than all right, he managed. It would be... He stopped, gathered himself. It would be everything. She hugged him then, properly, the way she used to before Margaret died and everything fractured. Jack held his daughter, felt Caleb and Owen join them, felt the weight of years dissolving into this single moment of reunion. Outside, the wolves sang to the stars. Inside, a family found its way back together through the simple act of choosing each other over fear, connection over safety, love over the comfortable numbness of isolation. The wilderness, indifferent but honest, witnessed it all and offered no judgment, only the eternal truth. Survival requires more than strength. It requires the courage to protect what matters, whatever the cost. The next morning brought crystalline clarity, the kind of cold that makes every sound sharp and every breath visible. Jack woke before dawn, as always, but this time Eleanor was already up, coffee brewing, preparing supplies for the first official den check. Couldn't sleep, she admitted. Kept thinking about that pup, wondering if the splint held through the night. Only one way to find out. Jack accepted the coffee she offered, though we should establish protocol. Can't go rushing in every time we're worried. The pack needs to maintain their routines. So, what's the protocol? Morning check, afternoon check. Keep distance unless we see obvious problems. Document everything, photos, notes, behavior observations. Treat it like the medical monitoring it is. They set out together after breakfast, leaving the boys at the cabin with strict instructions to stay inside. The walk to the den was becoming familiar now, the path they'd broken through snow yesterday still visible. The temperature had dropped overnight, and frost covered every surface in delicate patterns. The alpha appeared before they reached the den, stepping from the trees with the silent grace predators possessed. But instead of blocking their path, it fell into step beside them, an escort rather than a guardian. Jack recognized the shift from grudging tolerance to something approaching acceptance. At the den, the injured pup was visible at the entrance, the splint still secure, the pup attempting to play with its siblings despite the handicap. Eleanor knelt at a respectful distance, observing carefully. Splint's holding, no swelling visible. Pup's putting some weight on it, which is actually good, means the bone is aligned properly and beginning to stabilize. She made notes in a small journal. I'd say we're looking at good progress. The alpha watched her write, head tilted as if trying to understand the strange human behavior. When Eleanor finished, she held out the journal for the wolf to see a gesture of transparency, showing that she meant no deception. Jack snapped several photos with Owen's Polaroid, documenting the pup's condition. As the images developed, he laid them on a rock for the alpha to see. The wolf approached cautiously, sniffing the photographs, studying the images of its offspring with what seemed like recognition. I think he understands, Eleanor whispered. Not what the photos are exactly, but that we're documenting something important about his family. They left offerings dried meat, some bones with marrow, and retreated. The pack had made a fresh kill during the night, a deer carcass visible through the trees. But hunger still haunted their lean frames. Weeks of displacement couldn't be undone in days. Back at the cabin, Jack radioed Stan with the update. The wildlife officer sounded relieved. Good news, headquarters approved a 30-day monitoring period. After that, we'll reassess based on your reports and the pack's behavior. But Jack, I know. Any incidents, and the whole arrangement ends. Exactly. Don't let your guard down. The afternoon check went equally well. The pup was sleeping, curled against its mother, the splint undisturbed. The pack had fed well from their kill, and several wolves were resting in the weak sunlight that filtered through the trees. They acknowledged Jack and Eleanor's presence with raised heads and mild interest, but no one challenged their approach. It was almost peaceful. That changed at dusk. Jack was outside splitting wood when he heard a vehicle engine grinding up his rough road, not Hank's familiar truck. Something heavier, less practiced on the difficult terrain. He set down his axe, moved to the front of the cabin as a large pickup lurched into the clearing. Two men emerged, both carrying rifles. Hunters, From the look of their gear, expensive cold-weather clothing, high-end optics, the confidence of people accustomed to taking what they wanted from the wilderness. The driver, a thick-set man in his 50s, waved at Jack. "Evening. Name's Preston. This is my brother, Frank. We're tracking a wounded deer, might have come through your property." Jack's instincts flared, warning. Something was off, the story too convenient, their eyes too calculating. "Haven't seen any wounded deer, and this is private property. You need to turn around." Preston smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Now, we paid good money for our hunting permits. We've got a legal right to track wounded game across property lines. Conservation law. In 200. Crassus process. Not onto posted private property without permission, which you don't have." Frank, the younger brother, stepped forward. "Look, old man, we're not here to cause trouble. Just let us do a quick sweep of the area and we'll be gone." Eleanor emerged from the cabin, the boys behind her. She assessed the situation quickly, moved to stand beside Jack. "You heard him. Turn around and leave." Preston's eyes moved past them, scanning the tree line. His expression shifted, interest sharpening. "Those wolf tracks, fresh ones?" Jack's blood went cold. "Doesn't concern you?" "Actually, it does. There's a bounty on wolves in this region. Problem predators threatening livestock. We heard through the grapevine that a white pack was spotted around here." Preston's smile widened. "Rare specimens like that fetch good money from collectors. Trophy hunters pay premium for unusual pelts." "There's no bounty on wolves in this area," Jack said flatly. "And even if there were, you're not hunting on my land." Frank raised his rifle slightly, not quite pointing it at Jack, but making his presence known. "Now, we can do this friendly-like, or we can invoke our legal rights. Either way, we're checking this property." The alpha wolf chose that moment to appear at the clearing's edge, massive and pale in the failing light. Preston and Frank both turned, rifles coming up instinctively. Jack moved before thinking, stepping directly into their line of fire. "You shoot that wolf. You go through me first." "Dad!" Eleanor's voice was sharp with fear, but she didn't try to pull him back. Instead, she moved to stand beside him, blocking the shot. Caleb and Owen flanked them both, a human wall between the hunters and the wolf. Preston lowered his rifle, calculating. "That's a dangerous game, friend, protecting wolves over your own safety. That wolf has official protection under a monitoring agreement with Fish and Wildlife. You shoot it, you're violating federal law." Jack's voice carried absolute conviction. "And I've got a satellite phone inside that connects directly to the wildlife office. One call, and you'll have more legal trouble than any bounty could cover." It was a bluff, sort of. He had a phone, but whether he could get through before these men did something stupid was questionable. Frank and Preston exchanged glances, weighing options. The alpha remained visible, watching with those ancient gold eyes, seeming to understand that the humans were deciding something critical. Finally, Preston spat into the snow. "This isn't over. We know the pack's here now. We'll be back with proper documentation. You do that, and I'll make sure Fish and Wildlife knows you're targeting a protected population." The hunters retreated to their truck, engines roaring as they navigated back down the rough road. The family remained standing together until the sound faded completely. Only then did Jack allow himself to shake, adrenaline finally catching up. Eleanor gripped his arm, steadying him. That was incredibly stupid and incredibly brave. "Mostly stupid," Jack admitted. The alpha approached slowly, stopping 10 feet away. It looked at Jack, at the family standing united, then dipped its head, once a gesture that could have been acknowledgement or gratitude or simple respect between equals. Then it melted back into the forest, leaving them in darkness, broken only by cabin light. "We might have bigger problems than we thought," Caleb said quietly. Jack nodded. "But we face them together. That's what families do." 2 weeks passed in a rhythm that felt both foreign and natural to Jack. Each morning he and Eleanor checked on the pack, documenting the injured pup's steady recovery. Each evening, the family gathered around the table for dinner, conversation flowing with an ease that would have seemed impossible a month ago. The pup's splint came off on schedule, Eleanor removing it with the alpha, watching intently. The leg had healed straight and strong, and within days the young wolf was racing with its siblings, only the slightest hitch in its gait betraying its earlier injury. Stan returned for his official assessment, bringing news both good and concerning. Headquarters approved permanent protected status for the pack. You're now the official guardian of record, Jack. Congratulations or condolences, depending on how you look at it. And the concerning part? Jack asked, though he suspected he knew. Those hunters, Preston and Frank Dalton. They filed a complaint claiming you threatened them with a firearm. Obviously, we know that's fabricated, but it's created paperwork. They're pushing hard to get access to this area. Let them push. They're not getting near these wolves. That's the spirit. Just be careful. The Daltons have money and lawyers. They don't like being told no. But the Daltons didn't return, at least not immediately. Perhaps Stan's warnings about federal wildlife protection carried weight after all, or perhaps they'd simply moved on to easier targets. Either way, the threat receded into background concern rather than immediate danger. Philip called in late November, his voice uncertain through the phone static. Eleanor told me what's been happening. About the wolves, about everything. Jack gripped the receiver tighter. Your sister's been sending updates? Weekly emails. Photos, too. Owen's quite the photographer. Philip paused. I was wrong, Dad. Wrong to cut you off. Wrong to make Eleanor choose sides. I'm sorry it took this long to say it. I was wrong, too. Should have fought harder to keep our family together after your mother died. Maybe we were all wrong. Maybe that's just what grief does, makes everyone stupid for a while. Philip's voice softened. I'd like to visit. Bring Christine and the kids. Meet my nephews properly. See what you've built out there. Would that be all right? Jack looked around the cabin, Eleanor cooking at the stove, Caleb helping her chop vegetables, Owen at the table sketching wolves from memory. Family filling spaces that had been empty too long. That would be more than all right. That would be perfect. They set a date for late December, after the holidays. Jack hung up the phone and stood for a moment, absorbing the weight of reconciliation. Margaret would have been pleased, he thought. She'd always believed in second chances, in the possibility of healing even the deepest wounds. Christmas came quiet but meaningful. They decorated with what they could find, spruce boughs and pine cones, candles and carved wooden ornaments Jack made with Owen's help. Eleanor cooked from Margaret's recipes, filling the cabin with smells that evoked memories of celebrations past. On Christmas morning, they walked to the den together, bringing gifts for the pack, a deer carcass Jack had hunted specifically for them, additional food to help them through the hardest part of winter. The Alpha accepted their offering with what Jack had learned to recognize as wolf gratitude, a specific posture of the head, a softness in those gold eyes. The injured pup, fully healed now, bounded forward to investigate Owen, sniffing his boots with puppy enthusiasm before its mother called it back with a sharp bark. The boy laughed, delighted by the interaction. Think we'll ever be able to touch them? Owen asked. Probably not, Jack said. And that's how it should be. They're wild creatures, not pets. What we have is better than touching. It's respect, partnership, trust. January brought Philip and his family, his wife Christine, their 2 daughters aged 10 and 8. The cabin was crowded with 8 people, but it felt right. The girls were enchanted by the wolves, by their uncle's stories, by the wilderness their grandfather had chosen as home. One evening, with everyone gathered around the fire, Philip raised his glass of whiskey. A toast to second chances, to family finding its way back together, and to one stubborn old man who taught us that protecting what matters is worth any risk. They drank, and Jack felt something settle in his chest, not closure exactly, but completion. The circle that had broken 12 years ago was whole again, reformed in new shape, but fundamentally restored. Later, standing on the porch while others slept inside, Jack watched the clearing where wolves moved like pale ghosts through moonlit snow. The alpha appeared at the tree line, as it sometimes did, checking on the strange humans who'd become part of its territory's landscape. Jack raised his hand in greeting. The wolf watched for a moment, then turned and disappeared into the forest. A simple exchange, but one that contained volumes of mutual acknowledgement between survivors who'd learned that isolation was death, that connection required courage, that family, however you defined it, was worth fighting for. He went inside to the warmth and noise of his family, to Eleanor's laughter and Owen's questions and Caleb's grudging jokes, to Philip's stories and Christine's observations and his granddaughter's sleepy complaints about sharing space. The cabin that had been a tomb for 10 years was alive again. And Jack, who'd chosen death in life for so long, had chosen differently. Chosen risk over safety, connection over isolation, love over the cold comfort of solitude. The wolves had taught him that, in their way, they'd shown him that protecting family meant more than physical presence. It meant showing up, being vulnerable, fighting not just against threats but for possibility. Spring would bring new challenges. The pack would expand its territory, test boundaries, require continued vigilance. Philip's family would return home, though with promises to visit more often. Eleanor and the boys would need to establish more permanent arrangements, schooling for the boys, perhaps work for Eleanor. But those were tomorrow's concerns. Tonight, Jack stood in his crowded cabin, surrounded by family he'd almost lost forever, listening to wolves sing to stars, feeling Margaret's presence in the recipes on the table and the laughter in the air. He'd been given a gift he didn't deserve and hadn't expected the chance to be better than he'd been, to protect what mattered, not through isolation but through connection, to build rather than simply endure. Outside, the wilderness continued its ancient rhythms, indifferent but honest. Inside, a man who'd forgotten how to be part of something larger than himself remembered. And both the man and the wolves understood the same fundamental truth. Survival meant more than just staying alive. It meant having something worth surviving for. Jack closed his eyes and listened to his family breathe. To the wolves sing, to the wind move through ancient trees. After 10 years of silence, the world was full of sound again, and it was beautiful.